Section 3 of The Outline of Science, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Outline of Science, Volume 1, by J. Arthur Thomson. Section 3. Part 2. The Story of Evolution. Introductory. The beginning of the earth. Making a home for life. The first living creatures. 1. The evolution idea is a master key that opens many doors. It is a luminous interpretation of the world, throwing the light of the past upon the present. Everything is seen to be in antiquity, with a history behind it, a natural history, which enables us to understand, in some measure, how it has come to be as it is. We cannot say more than understand in some measure, for while the fact of evolution is certain, we are only beginning to discern the factors that have been at work. The evolution idea is very old, going back to some of the Greek philosophers, but it is only in modern times that it has become an essential part of our mental equipment. It is now an everyday intellectual tool. It was applied to the origin of the solar system and to the making of the earth before it was applied to plants and animals. It was extended from these to man himself. It spread to language, to folkways, to institutions. Within recent years the evolution idea has been applied to the chemical elements, for it appears that uranium may change into radium, that radium may produce helium, and that lead is the final stable result when the changes of uranium are complete. Perhaps all the elements may be the outcome of an inorganic evolution. Not less important is the extension of the evolution idea to the world within as well as to the world without. For alongside of the evolution of bodies and brains is the evolution of feelings and emotions, ideas and imagination. Organic evolution means that the present is the child of the past and the parent of the future. It is not a power or a principle. It is a process of becoming. It means that the present-day animals and plants, and all the subtle interrelations between them, have arisen in a natural, knowable way from a preceding state of affairs on the whole somewhat simpler, and that again from forms and interrelations simpler still, and so on backwards and backwards for millions of years, till we lose all clues in the thick mist that hangs over life's beginnings. Our solar system was once represented by a nebula of some sort, and we may speak of the evolution of the sun and the planets. But since it has been the same material throughout, that has changed in its distribution and forms, it might be clearer to use some word like genesis. Similarly, our human institutions were once very different from what they are now, and we may speak of the evolution of government or of cities. But man works with a purpose, with ideas and ideals in some measure controlling his actions and guiding his achievements, so that it is probably clearer to keep the good old word history for all processes of social becoming in which man has been a conscious agent. Now, between the genesis of the solar system and the history of civilization, there comes the vast process of organic evolution. The word development should be kept for the becoming of the individual, the chick out of the egg, for instance. Organic evolution is a continuous natural process of racial change, by successive steps in a definite direction, whereby distinctively new individualities arise, take root, and flourish, sometimes alongside of, and sometimes, sooner or later, in place of, the originative stock. Our domesticated breeds of pigeons and poultry are the results of evolutionary change whose origins are still with us, in the rock dove and the jungle fowl, but in most cases in wild nature the ancestral stocks of present-day forms are long since extinct, and in many cases they are unknown. Evolution is a long process of coming and going, appearing and disappearing, a long drawn-out, sublime process like a great piece of music. 2. The beginning of the earth. When we speak the language of science, we cannot say "in the beginning," for we do not know of and cannot think of any condition of things that did not arise from something that went before. But we may qualify the phrase, and legitimately inquire into the beginning of the earth within the solar system. If the result of this inquiry is to trace the sun and the planets back to a nebula, we reach only a relative beginning. The nebula has to be accounted for. And even before matter there may have been a pre-material world. If we say, as was said long ago, "In the beginning was mind," we may be expressing or trying to express a great truth, but we have gone beyond science. The Nebular Hypothesis. One of the grandest pictures that the scientific mind has ever thrown upon the screen is that of the nebular hypothesis. According to Laplace's famous form of this theory (1796), the solar system was once a gigantic glowing mass, spinning slowly and uniformly around its centre. As the incandescent world cloud of gas cooled and its speed of rotation increased, the shrinking mass gave off a separate whirling ring, which broke up and gathered together again as the first and most distant planet. The main mass gave off another ring, and another, till all the planets, including the earth, were formed. The central mass persisted as the sun. Laplace spoke of his theory, which Kant had anticipated 41 years before, with scientific caution. "Conjectures which I present with all the distrust which everything not the result of observation or of calculation ought to inspire." Subsequent research justified his distrust, for it has been shown that the original nebula need not have been hot and need not have been gaseous. Moreover, there are great difficulties in Laplace's theory of the separation of successive rings from the main mass, and of the condensation of a whirling gaseous ring into a planet. So it has come about that the picture of a hot gaseous nebula revolving as a unit body has given place to other pictures. Thus Sir Norman Lockyer pointed out (1890) that the earth is gathering to itself millions of meteorites every day. This has been going on for millions of years. In distant ages the accretion may have been vastly more rapid and voluminous, and so the earth has grown. Now the meteoritic contributions are undoubted, but they require a centre to attract them, and the difficulty is to account for the beginning of a collecting centre or planetary nucleus. Moreover, meteorites are sporadic and erratic, scattered hither and thither rather than collecting into unit bodies. As Professor Chamberlin says, "Meteorites have rather the characteristics of the wreckage of some earlier organization than of the parentage of our planetary system." Several other theories have been propounded to account for the origin of the earth, but the one that has found most favor in the eyes of authority is that of Chamberlin and Moulton. According to this theory, a great nebular mass condensed to form the sun, from which, under the attraction of passing stars, planet after planet, the earth included, was heaved off in the form of knotted spiral nebulae, like many of those now observed in the heavens. Of great importance were the knots, for they served as collecting centres, drawing flying matter into their clutches. Whatever part of the primitive bolt escaped and scattered was drawn out into independent orbits round the sun, forming the planetesimals, which behave like minute planets. These planetesimals formed the food on which the knots subsequently fed. The growth of the earth. It has been calculated that the newborn earth, the earth knot of Chamberlin's theory, had a diameter of about 5,500 miles, but it grew by drawing planetesimals into itself until it had a diameter of over 8,100 miles at the end of its growing period. Since then it has shrunk, by periodic shrinkages which have meant the buckling up of successive series of mountains, and it has now a diameter of 7,918 miles. But during the shrinking the earth became more varied. A sort of slow boiling of the internally hot earth often forced molten matter through the cold outer crust, and there came about a gradual assortment of lighter materials nearer the surface, and heavier materials deeper down. The continents are built of the lighter materials, such as granites, while the beds of the great oceans are made of the heavier materials, such as basalts. In limited areas land has often become sea, and sea has often given place to land, but the probability is that the distinction of the areas corresponding to the great continents and oceans goes back to a very early stage. The lithosphere is the more or less stable crust of the earth, which may have been, to begin with, about 50 miles in thickness. It seems that the young earth had no atmosphere, and that ages passed before water began to accumulate on its surface; before, in other words, there was any hydrosphere. The water came from the earth itself, to begin with, and it was long before there was any rain dissolving out saline matter from the exposed rocks and making the sea salt. The weathering of the high grounds of the ancient crust by air and water furnished the material which formed the sandstones and mudstones and other sedimentary rocks, which are said to amount to a thickness of over 50 miles in all. 3. Making a home for life. It is interesting to inquire how the callous, rough-and-tumble conditions of the outer world in early days were replaced by others that allowed of the germination and growth of that tender plant we call life. There are very tough living creatures, but the average organism is ill-suited for violence. Most living creatures are adapted to mild temperatures and gentle reactions. Hence the fundamental importance of the early atmosphere, heavy with planetesimal dust, in blanketing the earth against intensities of radiance from without, as Chamberlain says, and inequalities of radiance from within. This was the first preparation for life, but it was an atmosphere without free oxygen. Not less important was the appearance of pools and lakelets, of lakes and seas. Perhaps the early waters covered the earth, and water was the second preparation for life. Water that can dissolve a larger variety of substances in greater concentration than any other liquid. Water that in summer does not readily evaporate altogether from a pond, nor in winter freeze throughout its whole extent. Water that is such a mobile vehicle and such a subtle cleaver of substances. Water that forms over 80% of living matter itself. Of great significance was the abundance of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, in the form of carbonic acid and water, in the atmosphere of the cooling earth, for these three wonderful elements have a unique ensemble of properties, ready to enter into reactions and relations, making great diversity and complexity possible, favoring the formation of the plastic and permeable materials that build up living creatures. We must not pursue the idea, but it is clear that the stones and mortar of the inanimate world are such that they build a friendly home for life. Origin of living creatures upon the earth. During the early chapters of the earth's history, no living creature that we can imagine could possibly have lived there. The temperature was too high, there was neither atmosphere nor surface water. Therefore it follows that at some uncertain but inconceivably distant date, living creatures appeared upon the earth. No one knows how, but it is interesting to consider possibilities. From ancient times it has been a favorite answer that the dust of the earth may have become living in a way which is outside scientific description. This answer forecloses the question, and it is far too soon to do that. Science must often say ignoramus. Science should be slow to say ignorabimus. A second position held by Helmholtz, Lord Kelvin, and others suggests that minute living creatures may have come to the earth from elsewhere, in the cracks of a meteorite or among cosmic dust. It must be remembered that such can survive prolonged exposure to very low temperatures, that seeds can survive prolonged exposure to very low temperatures, that spores of bacteria can survive high temperature, that seeds of plants and germs of animals in a state of latent life can survive prolonged drought and absence of oxygen. It is possible, according to Berthelot, that as long as there is not molecular disintegration, vital activities may be suspended for a time, and may afterwards recommence when appropriate conditions are restored. Therefore one should be slow to say that a long journey through space is impossible. The obvious limitation of Lord Kelvin's theory is that it only shifts the problem of the origin of organisms, that is, living creatures, from the earth to elsewhere. The third answer is that living creatures of a very simple sort may have emerged on the earth's surface from not living material, for example from some semi-fluid carbon compounds activated by ferments. The tenability of this view is suggested by the achievements of the synthetic chemists, who are able artificially to build up substances such as oxalic acid, indigo, salicylic acid, caffeine, and grape sugar. We do not know, indeed, what in nature's laboratory would take the place of the clever synthetic chemist, but there seems to be a tendency to complexity. Corpuscles form atoms, atoms form molecules, small molecules large ones. Various concrete suggestions have been made in regard to the possible origin of living matter, which will be dealt with in a later chapter. So far as we know of what goes on today, there is no evidence of spontaneous generation. Organisms seem always to arise from pre-existing organisms of the same kind. Where any suggestion of the contrary has been fancied, there have been flaws in the experimenting. But it is one thing to accept the verdict omne vivum e vivo, as a fact to which experiment has not yet discovered an exception, and another thing to maintain that this must always have been true, or must always remain true. If the synthetic chemists should go on surpassing themselves, if substances like white of egg should be made artificially, and if we should get more light on possible steps by which simple living creatures may have arisen from not living materials, this would not greatly affect our general outlook on life, though it would increase our appreciation of what is often libelled as inert matter. If the dust of the earth did naturally give rise very long ago to living creatures, if they are in a real sense born of her and of the sunshine, then the whole world becomes more continuous and more vital, and all the inorganic groaning and travailing becomes more intelligible. 4. The first organisms upon the earth. We cannot have more than a speculative picture of the first living creatures upon the earth, or rather in the waters that covered the earth. A basis for speculation is to be found, however, in the simplest creatures living today, such as some of the bacteria and one-celled animalcules, especially those called protists, which have not taken any very definite step towards becoming either plants or animals. No one can be sure, but there is much to be said for the theory that the first creatures were microscopic globules of living matter, not unlike the simplest bacteria of today, but able to live on air, water, and dissolved salts. From such a source may have originated a race of one-celled marine organisms which were able to manufacture chlorophyll, or something like chlorophyll, that is to say, the green pigment which makes it possible for plants to utilize the energy of the sunlight in breaking up carbon dioxide and in building up (photosynthesis) carbon compounds like sugars and starch. These little units were probably encased in a cell wall of cellulose, but their boxed-in energy expressed itself in the undulatory movement of a lash or flagellum, by means of which they propelled themselves energetically through the water. There are many similar organisms today, mostly in water, but some of them, simple one-celled plants, paint the tree stems and even the paving stones green in wet weather. According to Professor A.H. Church, there was a long chapter in the history of the earth when the sea that covered everything teemed with these green flagellates, the originators of the vegetable kingdom. On another tack, however, there probably evolved a series of simple predatory creatures, not able to build up organic matter from air, water, and salts, but devouring their neighbors. These units were not closed in with cellulose, but remained naked, with their living matter or protoplasm flowing out in changeful processes, such as we see in the amoeba in the ditch, or in our own white blood corpuscles and other amoeboid cells. These were the originators of the animal kingdom. Thus from very simple protists the first animals and the first plants may have arisen. All were still very minute, and it is worth remembering that had there been any scientific spectator after our kind upon the earth during these long ages, he would have lamented the entire absence of life although the seas were teeming. The simplest forms of life and the protoplasm which Huxley called the physical basis of life will be dealt with in the chapter on biology in a later section of this work. First great steps in evolution: the first plants, the first animals, beginnings of bodies, evolution of sex, beginning of natural death. 1. The contrast between plants and animals. However it may have come about, there is no doubt at all that one of the first great steps in organic evolution was the forking of the genealogical tree into plants and animals, the most important parting of the ways in the whole history of nature. Typical plants have chlorophyll. They are able to feed at a low chemical level on air, water, and salts, using the energy of the sunlight in their photosynthesis. They have their cells boxed in by cellulose walls, so that their opportunities for motility are greatly restricted. They manufacture much more nutritive material than they need, and live far below their income. They have no ready way of getting rid of any nitrogenous waste matter that they may form, and this probably helps to keep them sluggish. Animals, on the other hand, feed at a high chemical level on the carbohydrates, for example starch and sugar, fats, and proteins, for example gluten, albumin, casein, which are manufactured by other animals, or to begin with by plants. Their cells have not cellulose walls, nor in most cases much wall of any kind, and motility in the majority is unrestricted. Animals live much more nearly up to their income. If we could make, for an animal and a plant of equal weight, two fractions showing the ratio of the upbuilding, constructive chemical processes to the down-breaking, disruptive chemical processes that go on in their respective bodies, the ratio for the plant would be much greater than the corresponding ratio for the animal. In other words, animals take the munitions which plants laboriously manufacture and explode them in locomotion and work, and the entire system of animate nature depends upon the photosynthesis that goes on in green plants. As the result of much more explosive life, animals have to deal with much in the way of nitrogenous waste products, the ashes of the living fire, but these are usually got rid of very effectively, for example in the kidney filters, and do not clog the system by being deposited as crystals and the like, as happens in plants. Sluggish animals like sea squirts, which have no kidneys, are exceptions that prove the rule, and it need hardly be said that the statements that have been made in regard to the contrasts between plants and animals are general statements. There is often a good deal of the plant about the animal, as in sedentary sponges, zoophytes, corals, and sea squirts, and there is often a little of the animal about the plant, as we see in the movements of all shoots and roots and leaves, and occasionally in the parts of the flower. But the important fact is that on the early forking of the genealogical tree, that is, the divergence of plants and animals, there depended and depends all the higher life of the animal kingdom, not to speak of mankind. The continuance of civilization, the upkeep of the human and animal population of the globe, and even the supply of oxygen to the air we breathe, depend on the silent laboratories of the green leaves, which are able with the help of the sunlight to use carbonic acid, water, and salts to build up the bread of life. 2. The beginning of land plants. It is highly probable that for long ages the waters covered the earth, and that all the primeval vegetation consisted of simple flagellates in the universal open sea. But contraction of the earth's crust brought about elevations and depressions of the sea floor, and in places the solid substratum was brought near enough the surface to allow the floating plants to begin to settle down without getting out of the light. This is how Professor Church pictures the beginning of a fixed vegetation, a very momentous step in evolution. It was perhaps among this early vegetation that animals had their first successes. As the floor of the sea in these shallow areas was raised higher and higher, there was a beginning of dry land. The sedentary plants already spoken of were the ancestors of the shore seaweeds, and there is no doubt that when we go down at the lowest tide, and wade cautiously out among the jungle of vegetation only exposed on such occasions, we are getting a glimpse of very ancient days. This is the forest primeval. The Protozoa. Animals below the level of zoophytes and sponges are called Protozoa. The word obviously means first animals, but all that we can say is that the very simplest of them may give us some hint of the simplicity of the original first animals, for it is quite certain that the vast majority of the Protozoa today are far too complicated to be thought of as primitive. Though most of them are microscopic, each is an animal complete in itself, with the same fundamental bodily attributes as are manifested in ourselves. They differ from animals of higher degree in not being built up of the unit areas or corpuscles called cells. They have no cells, no tissues, no organs, in the ordinary acceptation of these words, but many of them show a great complexity of internal structure, far exceeding that of the ordinary cells that build up the tissues of higher animals. They are complete living creatures which have not gone in for body-making. In the dim and distant past there was a time when the only animals were of the nature of Protozoa, and it is safe to say that one of the great steps in evolution was the establishment of three great types of Protozoa. (a) Some were very active, the Infusorians, like the slipper animalcule, the night light, noctiluca, which makes the sea phosphorescent at night, and the deadly trypanosome, which causes sleeping sickness. b. Others were very sluggish, the parasitic Sporozoa, like the malaria organism, which the mosquito introduces into man's body. c. Others were neither very active nor very passive, the rhizopods, with outflowing processes of living matter. This amoeboid line of evolution has been very successful. It is represented by the rhizopods, such as amoeba and the chalk-forming foraminifera, and the exquisitely beautiful flint-shelled radiolarians of the open sea. They have their counterparts in the amoeboid cells of most multicellular animals, such as the phagocytes, which migrate about in the body, engulfing and digesting intruding bacteria, serving as sappers and miners when something has to be broken down and built up again, and performing other useful offices. 3. The making of a body. The great naturalist Louis Agassiz once said that the biggest gulf in organic nature was that between the unicellular and the multicellular animals, protozoa and metazoa. But the gulf was bridged very long ago, when sponges, stinging animals, and simple worms were evolved, and showed for the first time a body. What would one not give to be able to account for the making of a body, one of the great steps in evolution? No one knows, but the problem is not altogether obscure. When an ordinary protozoan or one-celled animal divides into two or more, which is its way of multiplying, the daughter units thus formed float apart and live independent lives. But there are a few protozoa in which the daughter units are not quite separated off from one another, but remain coherent. Thus Volvox, a beautiful green ball, found in some kennels and the like, is a colony of 1,000 or even 10,000 cells. It has almost formed a body. But in this colony-making protozoan, and in others like it, the component cells are all of one kind, whereas in true multicellular animals there are different kinds of cells, showing division of labour. There are some other protozoa in which the nucleus or kernel divides into many nuclei within the cell. This is seen in the giant amoeba, Pelomyxa, sometimes found in duck ponds, or the beautiful Opalina, which always lives in the hind part of the frog's foot canal. If a portion of the living matter of these protozoa should gather round each of the nuclei, then that would be the beginning of a body. It would be still nearer the beginning of a body if division of labour set in, and if there was a setting apart of egg cells and sperm cells distinct from body cells. It was possibly in some such way that animals and plants with a body were first evolved. 2 points should be noticed: that body making is not essentially a matter of size, though it made large size possible, for the body of a many-celled wheel animalcule or rotifer is no bigger than many a protozoan. Yet the rotifer, we are thinking of Hydatina, has 900 odd cells, whereas the protozoan has only 1, except in forms like Volvox. Secondly, it is a luminous fact that every many-celled animal from sponge to man that multiplies in the ordinary way begins at the beginning again as a single cell, the fertilized egg cell. It is of course not an ordinary single cell that develops into an earthworm or a butterfly, an eagle or a man. It is a cell in which a rich inheritance, the fruition of ages, is somehow condensed. But it is interesting to bear in mind the elementary fact that every many-celled creature, reproduced in the ordinary way, and not by budding or the like, starts as a fertilized egg cell. The coherence of the daughter cells into which the fertilized egg cell divides is a reminiscence, as it were, of the primeval coherence of daughter units that made the first body possible. The beginning of sexual reproduction. A freshwater hydra, growing on the duckweed, usually multiplies by budding. It forms daughter buds, living images of itself. A check comes to nutrition, and these daughter buds go free. A big sea anemone may divide in 2 or more parts, which become separate animals. This is asexual reproduction, which means that the multiplication takes place by dividing into 2 or many portions, and not by liberating egg cells and sperm cells. Among animals, as among plants, asexual reproduction is very common. But it has great disadvantages, for it is apt to be physiologically expensive, and it is beset with difficulties when the body shows great division of labour, and is very intimately bound into unity. Thus no one can think of a bee or a bird multiplying by division or by budding. Moreover, if the body of the parent has suffered from injury or deterioration, the result of this is bound to be handed on to the next generation if asexual reproduction is the only method. Splitting into two or many parts was the old-fashioned way of multiplying, but one of the great steps in evolution was the discovery of a better method, namely, sexual reproduction. The gist of this is simply that during the process of body building, by the development of the fertilized egg cell, certain units, the germ cells, do not share in forming ordinary tissues or organs, but remain apart, continuing the full inheritance which was condensed in the fertilized egg cell. These cells, kept by themselves, are the originators of the future reproductive cells of the mature animal. They give rise to the egg cells and the sperm cells. The advantages of this method are great. 1. The new generation is started less expensively, for it is easier to shed germ cells into the cradle of the water than to separate off half of the body. 2. It is possible to start a great many new lives at once, and this may be of vital importance when the struggle for existence is very keen and when parental care is impossible. 3. The germ cells are little likely to be prejudicially affected by disadvantageous dints impressed on the body of the parent, little likely unless the dints have peculiarly penetrating consequences, as in the case of poisons. 4. A further advantage is implied in the formation of two kinds of germ cells, the ovum or egg cell, with a considerable amount of building material and often with a legacy of nutritive yolk; the spermatozoon or sperm cell, adapted to move in fluids and to find the ovum from a distance, thus securing change-provoking cross-fertilization. 4. The evolution of sex. Another of the great steps in organic evolution was the differentiation of two different physiological types, the male or sperm producer and the female or egg producer. It seems to be a deep-seated difference in constitution which leads one egg to develop into a male, and another, lying beside it in the nest, into a female. In the case of pigeons, it seems almost certain, from the work of Professor Oscar Riddle, that there are two kinds of egg, a male-producing egg and a female-producing egg, which differ in their yolk-forming and other physiological characters. In sea urchins we often find two creatures superficially indistinguishable, but the one is a female with large ovaries, and the other is a male with equally large testes. Here the physiological difference does not affect the body as a whole, but the reproductive organs or gonads only, though more intimate physiology would doubtless discover differences in the blood or in the chemical routine metabolism. In a large number of cases, however, there are marked superficial differences between the sexes, and every one is familiar with such contrasts as peacock and peahen, stag and hind. In such cases the physiological difference between the sperm producer and the ovum producer, for this is the essential difference, saturates through the body and expresses itself in masculine and feminine structures and modes of behaviour. The expression of the masculine and feminine characters is in some cases under the control of hormones or chemical messengers which are carried by the blood from the reproductive organs throughout the body, and pull the trigger which brings about the development of an antler or a wattle, or a decorative plume, or a capacity for vocal and saltatory display. In some cases it is certain that the female carries in a latent state the masculine features, but these are kept from expressing themselves by other chemical messengers from the ovary. Of these chemical messengers more must be said later on. Recent research has shown that while the difference between male and female is very deep-rooted, corresponding to a difference in gearing, it is not always clear-cut. Thus a hen pigeon may be very masculine, and a cock pigeon very feminine. The difference is in degree, not in kind. 5. What is the meaning of the universal, or almost universal, inevitableness of death? A sequoia, or big tree, of California has been known to live for over 2000 years, but eventually it died. A centenarian tortoise has been known, and a sea anemone 60 years of age, but eventually they die. What is the meaning of this apparently inevitable stoppage of bodily life? The beginning of natural death. There are three chief kinds of death. (a) The great majority of animals come to a violent end, being devoured by others or killed by sudden and extreme changes in their surroundings. (b) When an animal enters a new habitat or comes into new associations with other organisms, it may be invaded by a microbe or by some larger parasite to which it is unaccustomed and to which it can offer no resistance. With many parasites a live and let live compromise is arrived at, but new parasites are apt to be fatal, as man knows to his cost when he is bitten by a tsetse fly which infects him with a microscopic animal, a trypanosome, that causes sleeping sickness. In many animals the parasites are not troublesome as long as the host is vigorous, but if the host is out of condition the parasites may get the upper hand, as in the so-called grouse disease, and become fatal. (c) But besides violent death and microbic or parasitic death, there is natural death. This is in great part to be regarded as the price paid for a body. A body worth having implies complexity or division of labor, and this implies certain internal furnishings of a more or less stable kind, in which the effects of wear and tear are apt to accumulate. It is not the living matter itself that grows old, so much as the framework in which it works, the furnishings of the vital laboratory. There are various processes of rejuvenescence, for example rest, repair, change, reorganization, which work against the inevitable processes of senescence, but sooner or later the victory is with aging. Another deep reason for natural death is to be found in the physiological expensiveness of reproduction, for many animals, from worms to eels, illustrate natural death as the nemesis of starting new lives. Now it is a very striking fact that to a large degree the simplest animals or protozoa are exempt from natural death. They are so relatively simple that they can continually recuperate by rest and repair. They do not accumulate any bad deaths. Moreover, their modes of multiplying, by dividing into two or many units, are very inexpensive physiologically. It seems that in some measure this bodily immortality of the protozoa is shared by some simple many-celled animals like the freshwater hydra and planarian worms. Here is an interesting chapter in evolution, the evolution of means of evading or staving off natural death. Thus there is the well-known case of the pallilar worm of the coral reefs, where the body breaks up in liberating the germ cells, but the head end remains fixed in a crevice of the coral, and buds out a new body at leisure. Along with the evolution of the ways of avoiding death should be considered also the gradual establishment of the length of life best suited to the welfare of the species, and the punctuation of the life history to suit various conditions. 6. Great acquisitions. In animals like sea anemones and jellyfishes the general symmetry of the body is radial, that is to say, there is no right or left, and the body might be halved along many planes. It is a kind of symmetry well suited for sedentary or for drifting life. But worms began the profitable habit of moving with one end of the body always in front, and from worms to man the great majority of animals have bilateral symmetry. They have a right and a left side, and there is only one cut that halves the body. This kind of symmetry is suited for a more strenuous life than radial animals show. It is suited for pursuing food, for avoiding enemies, for chasing mates. And with the establishment of bilateral symmetry must be associated the establishment of head brains, the beginning of which is to be found in some simple worm types. Among the other great acquisitions gradually evolved we may notice a well-developed head with sense organs, the establishment of large internal surfaces such as the digestive and absorptive wall of the food canal, the origin of quickly contracting striped muscle and of muscular appendages, the formation of blood as a distributing medium throughout the body, from which all the parts take what they need and to which they also contribute. Another very important acquisition, almost confined, so far as is known, to backboned animals, was the evolution of what are called glands of internal secretion, such as the thyroid and the suprarenal. These manufacture subtle chemical substances which are distributed by the blood throughout the body, and have a manifold influence in regulating and harmonizing the vital processes. Some of these chemical messengers are called hormones, which stimulate organs and tissues to greater activity. Others are called chalones, which put on a brake. Some regulate growth, and others rapidly alter the pressure and composition of the blood. Some of them call into active development certain parts of the body which have been, as it were, waiting for an appropriate trigger pulling. Thus, at the proper time, the milk glands of a mammalian mother are awakened from their dormancy. This very interesting outcome of evolution will be dealt with in another portion of this work. End of Section 3